Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, September 10th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about Senator Mitch McConnell's Senate Leadership Fund, the Republican fund that focuses and allocates money towards Republican candidates across this nation in upcoming competitive Senate races. Now, you might recognize this article from just about 2 weeks ago when we covered how the Republican Party canceled ad buys in the state of Arizona and also Alaska. But the major headline here was that the state of Arizona was one that was canceled despite it being an overwhelmingly competitive seat, at least to the surface level and naked eye to the American public. The state of Arizona is one of the most competitive races and states from the 2020 presidential election, in which President Biden won here, being the second closest state of the entire country by 0.2%. Arizona was an immediate pickup opportunity for the GOP heading into the 2022 midterm elections, and yet Mitch McConnell decided to withdraw ad money from the state of Arizona ahead of November. Then came even more news from the Mitch McConnell Leadership Fund focused on post-Labor Day allocations. Essentially, this is the final stretch of the campaign season. After Labor Day, you sort of hit 2 months until Election Day, in which the Republican Party, with Mitch McConnell, did not allocate any funds to the state of Arizona, and instead allocated it to Georgia, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Nevada. 4 of these races, I'd argue, are less competitive than the state of Arizona. But it seems as if there is a lot more at play here as well. It comes down to who is running in these races too. Looking at the Republican candidate here, Blake Masters, one who was funded largely in part by Peter Thiel, the very well-known CEO who has been backing Republican candidates for quite some time now, someone who had been very closely associated with Blake Masters and propelled him to victory in the primary, at least in terms of money and connections, and what that had done for Blake Masters' campaign was essentially win him a nomination against a statewide attorney general. And when you move towards the general election, it comes to a point where the Republican Party was fighting over who was going to allocate money to Blake Masters. On one hand, Mitch McConnell doesn't think that he has to do it. On the other hand, Peter Thiel also doesn't think that he has to do it. And together, without allocating any funds, the Democrats out-fundraise and outpace the Republican within this race. It doesn't seem to be looking too good, at least, for Blake Masters within the state of Arizona when it comes down to fundraising numbers. And when Mitch McConnell decides after Labor Day, in terms of allocations, to not allocate any money and instead focus it on sometimes less competitive races, it's a very big snub to Blake Masters and his chances at winning this Senate seat. Now, I will start off by saying that the Senate race here is not exactly the most competitive. It seems as if Mark Kelly is on track to win re-election, not necessarily by an overwhelmingly large margin, but certainly on track to do so. And when you take a look at our overarching Senate map, you will find that the state of Arizona is less competitive than the state of Wisconsin, or less competitive than the state of Nevada, than the state of Georgia, and in some cases, the states of North Carolina, and by some people's characterizations, the state of Ohio. I don't know if I entirely buy that, but the fact that we're in this point where it could be is quite substantial. But I will also say that all of the states that I've already mentioned are still states that the GOP is heavily funding, including states like the state of Pennsylvania, in which you have a very competitive race, at least previously, that has turned into a not-so-competitive race that now doesn't necessarily seem to need funding as much as Blake Masters in the state of Arizona. Quite frankly, Dr. Oz is rich. He does not need to get funding from the Senate Leadership PAC. He can self-fund this campaign multiple times over and still have an extremely large amount of money. I mean, looking at the Pennsylvania Senate race, it has also come to a point where John Fetterman has about an 80% chance of victory. So the GOP at this point should be allocating their funds to races that are more competitive, and they are, except they are leaving out the state of Arizona. And considering at this point in time, we are at the narrowest Senate majority of the entire election cycle, the entirety of the 21st century, just because it's the narrowest possible, a 50-50 tie with the vice president breaking said tie, every single race matters. And if Arizona is being continuously neglected, I mean, it isn't just, canceling ad buys, but it's also not allocating additional funds that you get in return towards this state. I mean, it is baffling to say the least. And when you have a billionaire and also a Senate minority leader sort of battling it out as to who's going to be spending more money on this race or who's going to be actually allocating funds within it, it calls into question, who's going to break, who's going to be allocating these funds. And if it doesn't end up happening, Blake Masters isn't going to win this election. Looking at national polling data too, I will say that the state of Arizona is likely to follow similar to the national generic ballot. And right now, Democrats are steadily increasing it with a 1.2% lead nationwide. Steadily increasing does not mean that they are on track to get to 2018 type of numbers, 2020 type of numbers, but it does mean they are on track to do better than they did yesterday, or 2 days ago, or a month ago, or certainly 2-3 months ago. The generic ballot also is in a point where the Democrats, if they do continue to expand it, could end up with about a 2 to 3 point lead, which is exactly what happened in the generic ballot in 2020 that handed Mark Kelly a victory within the state of Arizona. Democrats won nationally by about 3.5. Mark Kelly won by 2.4%. So you're talking about a point drop off from the national generic ballot, but quite frankly, it looks like Mark Kelly is on track to do better than Democrats will, nationally speaking. And new polls actually came out of the state of Arizona today that have made people question the possibility that Blake Masters does win this race. But I will say that the polls that have been released, all of them that the Republican Party cites as an increase for the GOP, something that shows the Republican Party is on track for victory. If it showed they were on track for victory, don't you think the polls would have shown the Republican ahead? Right now, Mark Kelly leads, and he leads for a reason. Blake Masters does not, and all of these polls, as much as the GOP would like to make the argument that polls overestimate Democrats within the state of Arizona, it really only happened with Mark Kelly in the Senate race, but beyond that, not so much. And the poll that Republicans are citing all across many forms of social media and news media is the Emerson College poll that was done recently, that was released in the Senate race, that shows Mark Kelly leading by 2. But guess what? The poll that showed him ahead by 3 in 2020 ended up being one of the most accurate polls. And if they're saying Mark Kelly is winning, and it's an accurate pollster, well, I'd tend to trust it. In addition to that, it also has a history of sometimes underestimating Democrats statewide. In 2018, they said that Kyrsten Sinema would win by 1. They ended up being the only correct pollster in terms of the actual predictor. The rest of them said that Republicans were going to win. Trafalgar said that McSally was going to win by 2. That was wrong. OH Predictive Insight said McSally was going to win by 1. That was wrong. Harris X, Fox News, Gravitz Institute, these are all pollsters that were wrong in 2018 that said that the Republicans were going to win in the state of Arizona. Point being that the margins here ended up being about a 3-point shift, but Emerson College was only about a point off. In 2020, in the Senate race, they were less than a point off, and in 2022, what's to say they're not going to be off by just a very narrow amount, similar to where it was previously? Because at that point, it means that Mark Kelly still wins the race. A 2-point lead is not exactly super substantial for Mark Kelly, but it is still a lead regardless. And we also are nowhere near a national environment like 2018 or 2020. I think because we've come to a point where our Senate races here have become so lopsided in favor of the Democratic Party, largely in part due to the GOP fielding poor candidates across many of their races, we have started to treat 2022 as any other type of election year. That's not where we are. We are in, until further notice, a red wave year. We are in an approval rating year in which the president is unpopular. So when you think that, you see you have the Democrats and the Republicans in a point where they are competitive in the generic ballot. In 2020, Democrats were up by 7. In 2018, they were up by 8. In the president's approval rating, Trump was down in 2018 and 2020, and now Biden is down by even more than Trump was down in 2020 on Election Day. And yet, for some reason, Arizona is lopsided. If this was 2018, Mark Kelly would be winning by 8 to 9 points. If this was 2020, he would be winning by 4 to 5 points. But since it is 2022, the race is inevitably going to be competitive. But where we are nationally means that with a good GOP candidate, for instance, Doug Ducey, who if I was the, Rick Scott in his position for the NRSC, I would have heavily petitioned and fielded Doug Ducey to run. Who cares what Trump says? Doug Ducey probably could have won that primary there. Mark Kelly would be losing cataclysmically to Doug Ducey should Ducey have won the nomination. I think we'd be talking about a 5 to 6 point loss. And that's just the way it would be with this type of national environment. But that's not what we have. Not because Mark Kelly individually, and I will give him the huge benefit of just the fact that he is a very strong candidate. I think he is one of the best fielded Democrats from the 2020 election cycle and also the 2022 election cycle when I'm rating these incumbents. But I will say that that isn't everything. And as 2010 showed, as 2014 showed, you can be a very popular Democrat and still lose your election. And that probably would have been the case for Mark Kelly, but it simply is not, because Blake Masters is a bad candidate. So what does this have to do, going back to the money issue? Well, when you have a candidate who isn't exactly swaying the masses, you need heavy hitters. And right now, the Republican Party did that. They did that by withdrawing money from Arizona, not continuing any money to Arizona, and focusing on, let's say, races in Pennsylvania or Georgia or Wisconsin or Nevada, 4 races that I'd argue are more competitive than the state of Arizona, or sorry, not more competitive, on par. I think Pennsylvania less so. I think North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania really don't need this Mitch McConnell funding, but they're getting it when Arizona is not. I see the argument for Georgia. I see the argument for Wisconsin and Nevada, and this is not an argument that we shouldn't be funding it if we are, looking at it from the Republican lens, that they shouldn't be funding it, but rather they should be funding Arizona in addition. That's why this is really eye-catching. That $0 allocated to the state of Arizona is really eye-catching, largely because of the fact, I didn't mean to say largely because of the fact that this race is not a done deal. As much as Democrats would like to treat it as such, Blake Masters still has about a 1 in 4 chance at victory. And the fact is, Mitch McConnell is spending money on Pennsylvania, where Dr. Oz has a less high chance of victory, or North Carolina, where the Republican is practically on track for victory, or Wisconsin, where they have a Republican incumbent, Ron Johnson, who is still on track for victory, even though ever so slightly. Arizona should be the priority here for the GOP. I don't think it should be any of these other races, but I do think they all should get a portion of funding. But right now, Blake Masters needs it the most, because money can talk. Money can sway public opinion, and it has many, many times in the past. Even looking at the predicted betting markets, the Democrats went from a point where they were leading, then losing, and then back to leading now. If you take a look at the betting markets from early 2021, Democrats were ahead in this race. But for nearly, half a year, or in fact more than that, the Republicans led in the betting markets, sometimes by exceptionally high margins. And the reason for that was because the expectation was that Republicans were going to go full force in this race. They were going to nominate a candidate that was super strong, Mark Brnovich, Doug Ducey, someone of that sort. But when both of those things fell through, with Mark Kelly out fundraising them and doing a lot better in terms of candidate quality, the Democrats skyrocketed in terms of their chances. And ultimately, that maintains until now. I think what we should see and look for in terms of a change in position, and a change in rhetoric, and a change in approach in these midterms, specifically in the state of Arizona, is to see what type of outside spending goes into this race. We are now 59 days until the midterm elections, and the Democrats have severely out-fundraised the Republicans in many, many of these races, including the state of Arizona. Everything is on the line. Every single race matters, and nothing is going to be left unturned, except for maybe the state of Arizona. If they continue this political ad drought, maybe in part due to an argument or an inability to find where this funding is coming from, the Republicans are going to lose Arizona, and they are going to lose it by choice. This is a state that should have been an automatic GOP flip had everything else gone at least slightly right for them. But not only did it not go slightly right, it went horribly wrong. And you can find that to be true in many other races as well. Pennsylvania, Ohio. Even though Ohio is still probably going to go red, J.D. Vance should not be significantly underperforming Trump, even amongst Republican pollsters, and he is. Wisconsin, you are seeing a race that should not have been competitive from the beginning, and now is one of the most competitive. Georgia, where Herschel Walker sure is doing well against Warnock in recent polls, that's going to warrant another video, but looking at those numbers there, honestly, a lot of them overestimated Loeffler. All of them actually said that Loeffler was going to win in the runoff election, which was incorrect. So I would say I take those polls with a grain of salt, but I also recognize that, Herschel Walker, had he been Brian Kemp or Doug Collins or some of the sort, they would have obliterated Raphael Warnock. Our national environment is nowhere near where it was in 2020, and somehow these Senate Democrats are performing better than they did in 2020, or on par with where they were when the national environment was about 7 points more to the left. It's fascinating, to say the least, to see how 2022 has completely walked back away from the GOP, especially on these more individualized and statewide races. Because unlike the House, the Senate is ultimately projected to go towards the Democrats. And Republicans were in the lead. Republicans did have the advantage. When the 538 forecast dropped, Republicans had about a 60% chance at winning control of the Senate. And obviously, that didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen is because Republicans started to suffer major losses. And as time continued and continued and continued, it only got better for Democrats. And as we head into November, it honestly could get a lot worse for the GOP. Democrats are at this point where they need to maintain exactly where they are right now, and the GOP is making it easy for them to do that in the state of Arizona. Without funding from major billionaires, without funding from the National Republican Party, Blake Masters is left out to dry. whereas Mark Kelly, on his own as an electoral and fundraising juggernaut, is also getting support from national Democrats because they recognize the importance of the state of Arizona. But as of right now, I can't say I think Mitch McConnell is, or maybe he's doing things out of spite that ultimately will cost him the Senate majority this November. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.